Welcome to News Inside. I'm An Jang-hyun. Let's meet our panelists. Professor Shin Sang-yup from Kyung University Graduate School of International Studies. Good to have you back. And Dr. Pong Young-sik from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome back. Now, President Park Geun-hye began her tour to Africa's three countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya, on Wednesday. These nations have the largest economies in East Africa and are part of a continent that's been dubbed the world's last frontier. We have more details about the three countries on President Park's itinerary.
The first country on President Park Geun-hye's itinerary is Ethiopia, an ally of South Korea that fought in the Korean War. It's roughly 5 times the size of the Korean peninsula with a population of 96 million, making it the second largest in Africa. Recently, it has been pushing for aggressive development projects in order to improve the social environment and living conditions. Uganda's GDP currently stands at only $25 billion, but geographically it's situated near Lake Victoria and the Nile River upstream and holds crude oil and rich mineral resources, giving it great potential for development. It had maintained close ties with North Korea, but more recently there has been a shift towards South Korea on the back of growing interest in the country's community development movement, the Semaul-undong. Kenya is considered the gateway to East Africa with a population of 45 million and a GDP of $64.7 billion. On the heels of the government's Kenya Vision 2030 announced in 2008, it has announced large-scale infrastructure projects such as electricity, transportation, and railways. Especially worth noting is the Kanza Tech City, for which it's working to secure foreign investment in order to transform it into a new information technology hub.
Now, Korea established diplomatic ties with all three of these countries between 1963 and 64 under late President Park Geun-hye. Would you tell us how that came to be and also why this is part of his daughter, President Park Geun-hye's diplomatic agenda?
Yeah, I mean, come to think about the beginning of the tie between African countries and South Korea, it is a clear testimony of South Korea's rise in world politics and economy. South Korea has a lot to share with African countries because South Korea was at the same starting point in terms of economic development and nation building in 1960s. South Korea's success is a clear testimony of the remarkable turnaround of the developing countries. And President Park Geun-hye's visit as a current president of South Korea, but as well as a daughter of the former President Park Geun-hye to these countries will be very refreshing moments for the people in the receiving countries in Africa about their potential and very hopeful future. And in the 1960s, the main reason for diplomatic ties between South Korea and these African countries was a reflection of the strategic consideration in the context of the inter-Korean competition in international organizations such as the United Nations in order to secure the international support because the support was oftentimes measured by the sheer number of the votes cast by the members of these important international organizations on deciding the memberships. So looking back the entire history of the diplomatic relations between South Korean and African countries is very helpful reminder for South Koreans about what they have achieved for the past 50 years.
Now, of these three countries, Ethiopia holds a special place in Korea's history, having sent troops to fight in the Korean War. And I believe this led to many exchanges between the two countries over the years.
Yes. Well, as you are explained already, Ethiopia is only one African country out of 54 countries in the continent. They sent about 6,000 soldiers to Korea during the Korean War. Based on this special relations between two countries, the economic ties between two countries has been developed, particularly in the form of ODA, Official Development Assistance. Well, for about 14 years from 1991 up to 2014, the Korean government has provided about $88.6 million aid to Ethiopia. I think particularly those aid has been focused on the water management and the sanitary sector and development of land and the transportation and energy sector. I think based on this economic ties established over the last 2 decades, almost 2 decades, I think it is expected to strengthen the trade relations between two countries. But at the moment, the per capita income in Ethiopia is about $550, but the potentiality, the Ethiopia has a big potentiality as a trading partner for Korea.
Now, while she's in the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, the president is going to deliver a speech at the headquarters of the African Union, becoming the first Korean head of state to do so. What significance does that hold?
The significance is that the South Korean president will be speaking to the entire 54 member countries of the African Union. It's equivalent to President Park speaking to the European Commission, representing the entire European continent. The African Union was organized by the merger of the Organization for African Unity created in 1963 and the African Economic Community in 2001. So it's a reflection of the collective desire of the African people and the nations to reach the level of regional unity that has been manifested in the case of European Union in order to provide the African solutions to African problems and also raise the voice in clear reflection of the interest and aspirations of the African people in the aftermath of their liberation from the European colonial occupation in 1960s. One interesting change in terms of governance of the African Union is that in the past, the focus of the activities of the African Union in the world stage has been focused on the protecting the principle of the sovereign independence of African countries. But these days, the voice of the African Union is far more open to addressing the common stance against the rise of international terrorism, like Boko Haram or Taliban, or the pirates in Somalia. So the lack of governance or the problem with the failed states in the African continent have been more or less rather very open, accepted, and deliberated by the members of the African Union these days.
Now, we can't deny that there were quite a few negative images commonly associated with Africa, such as conflict, poverty, or corruption. So how is it that this continent is all of a sudden the new land of opportunity?
Well, it is true that many of the African countries are still a riddle, with the problem with internal turmoils and the issue of nation building. And it is also true that about 45% of the entire population living in the African country are still below the absolute poverty line. But when you consider the negative sides, very pervasive in African continent, that can be also, paradoxically speaking, viewed as an evidence that African continent in general has a great upward potential for economic growth, because the starting line is so low that it only have a more upward room to grow. When you look back the history of the world economy, then the most successful countries are the ones who took boldly calculated risk to charter into the virgin territories, loaded with many difficulties and uncertainties. Even the case of South Korea is a clear evidence that after the Korean War in 1950s, then nobody would take South Korea so seriously alongside with other Asian countries. But now many of the Asian countries who had been ruled out as a potential member of the world economy have grown spectacular fashion and become so-called the four Asian tigers or new dragons. So if the experience of Asian tigers can shed some light about the future world economy, after we have witnessed the dawning of the glory of BRICS, or the downturn of China's economy, or dwindling oil revenue in the Middle East, then African continent should be the only remaining new frontier for a world economy's future. So it is timely decision by South Korean government to try to have a foothold in the African countries.
Well, currently, China is Africa's largest trading partner, accounting for about 20% of imports in sub-Saharan Africa, and about 15% of its exports as well. How did that come to be? Did China have some sort of a foresight?
Well, as you are, I mean, we have heard many news about the cooperation between China and the African countries. I think current Chinese President Xi Jinping has already visited African nations several times. From the beginning of 1950s, Chinese government started to invite the African students to China, educate them. Many of them, when they returned to their nations, they became they are taking higher positions, leading positions in the government and the private sector. So we can say there are some pro-China groups in many African countries. Particularly from the beginning of 2000, the Chinese government, Chinese economy has achieved very fast economic growth. To achieve the economic growth, definitely they needed the huge amount of natural resources. And then the suppliers of raw materials have been the African nations, African countries. And on the top of this one, through ODA, well, China has provided huge amount of aid to African countries. So they can gain the huge amount of aid as well as economic benefits from the very strong economic ties with China. And when you look at the trade volume between China and the African countries, in the year 2000, total trade volume was only $10.6 billion. But in the 2014, the total trade volume became $221.6 billion. It has increased as many as 21 times. It's really a big increase. So we can say that because of the special relations in the past, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and from the 2000 mainly, the economic relations between China and Africa strengthened very vastly, and then right now we can say they became very close economic partners.
Well, in comparison, Korea's trade with African countries has been rather slow. What kind of presence do Korean companies have there, and what sort of obstacles do they encounter when trying to enter the market?
If I may highlight the positive signs first, then penetration of the South Korean companies in the domestic market, especially the domestic markets of the home electronics, has been quite successful and impressive. Like Samsung Electronics and LG have been doing very well in the domestic market of African countries. And they came up with a very ingenious product such as a cool heater refrigerator, which can save the power when the power supply is halted. But of course, there is more room for more business that should be done by the Korean companies. After all, Africa is a huge market for any business partners. The size of its territory is 6 times larger than that of Europe, which also has 1.2 billion people in terms of size of total population. And the future is not so bleak, according to the International Monetary Fund's recent statistics, because of the average annual growth rate of the 45 sub-Saharan states in Africa. Since 2010, the average annual economic growth rate was around 5%, which is far higher than the average annual growth rate of the OECD member countries. So if you just focus on the current status of the national economies of the Asian countries, then you have all the reasons to be disappointed and conservative with your business decisions. But if you carefully look at the entire trajectory of the economic development of many African countries, including 3 countries that President Park is going to visit, then you have every reasons to be very proactive.
Which is why many analysts say breaking into the African market is no longer a matter of choice, but of necessity. That's why there are a lot of expectations on what opportunities the president's trip will bring. We talked to some experts about their hopes and plans.
아프리카가 세계 많은 나라들의 주목을 받는 이유 중에 하나는요, 사실은 빠른 속도로 성장하고 있는 중산층입니다. 이 중산층이 경제 성장을 견인할 뿐더러 그다음에 정치적 민주화에도 크게 기여하고 있거든요. 그래서 지금 아프리카 대륙 전체적으로 한 3억 명의 사람들이 중산층으로 그렇게 범주화된다고 해요. 그리고 아프리카의 다른 곳에 비해서 자원이 많이 매장이 되어 있지 않다고 그렇게 알았었는데, 최근에는 케냐와 우간다에서 석유가 발견이 돼가고요. 이곳이 점점 자원의 각축장이 될 것 같은 그런 느낌이 듭니다.
인건비가 중국의 7분의 1, 방글라데시의 2분의 1 정도 되는 최저 25불에서 200불 정도 수준이고, 교육 수준이 상당히 높고 영어를 구사할 수 있는 근로자가 상당히 많이 있습니다. 그리고 세계에서 가장 싼 전기비로 킬로와트당 약 3센트를 차지하고 있습니다. 에티오피아는 미국의 아고아라는 무역 특혜법이 적용을 받고 있고, 그리고 EU로부터는 Everything but Arm, 그래서 무기를 제외한 모든 상업적 거래는 관세가 없습니다. 우리 기업이 에티오피아로 진출한다면은 미국과 EU 시장에 무관세로 수출할 수가 있습니다.
동아프리카 시장은 건설 시장 규모가 한 220억 불 정도 되고요. 아프리카 전체 시장의 한 20% 정도 됩니다. 규모 면에서는 크진 않지만 최근에 그 경제 성장 속도 그리고 인구 도시화가 빠르게 진행이 되고 있기 때문에 앞으로 건설 시장도 상당히 크게 성장할 것으로 이렇게 전망이 됩니다. 전력이라든지 교통, 물 관련 상하수도 쪽으로 많은 그 프로젝트가 추진이 돼야 될 것으로 이렇게 보여집니다.
So how can we strengthen our ties with Africa?
Well, from the Chinese case, definitely we have to build our human network with the African nations. Well, as far as I know, the African markets are not well developed yet. So the human network seems to be very important, determining the market shares in each African nations. And secondly, I think there are big differences in the development stage of economy industries each African nations has. So considering the local the conditions, situations, we have to tailored approaches in order to strengthen economic ties. If I give you some example, Uganda has been a kind of some stepping stone for us to enter into African markets, and so we have more the trusts in some sense between two countries owing to the efforts we have made over the last years. Definitely we can maybe start more business more easily comparing with the African nations. So I think we have to develop the tailor-made the approaches considering the local the conditions.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bong?
Well, we can delineate many useful lessons from the successful case of China forging partnership with African countries. The reason why China has enjoyed this welcoming reception from African countries is that because China does not carry the negative legacy of colonialism that was tied to the European countries. South Korea, just like China, is a good example, as Professor Shin emphasized, a case that clearly testifying that you don't have to sacrifice your aspiration for better political system for the sake of achieving economic development. You can have them both, only minimum amount of lag between them. And South Korea's experience and the know-hows have every reason to be very appealing to these African countries who are, on one hand, still undergoing very difficult test of internal unity and stability and the problem of government to be overcome. And on the other hand, the desire to increase the basic living standard.
Well, this trip is not only about economic benefits, it's also about peace, security, culture, and development. Over the years, economic and social aid projects have kept Korea linked to Africa. Let's take a look at the official development assistance Korea has so far extended to this region.
Following its membership to the OECD's Development Assistance Committee in 2009 as the 24th nation, Korea has been increasing its scale of official development assistance, or ODA, each year. Over the past 5 years, it posted a 10% increase, and out of the total sum provided in 2014, 24% was dedicated to Africa. Especially in 2014, Korea International Cooperation Agency, or KOICA, provided $120 million in aid supporting needs in education, healthcare, public administration, and agro-fisheries. The three nations President Park Geun-hye is visiting are also recipients of Korea's assistance projects. So far, Seoul has offered over $88 million to Ethiopia, $27 million to Uganda, and $39 million to Kenya in grants.
Well, having gone from an ODA recipient to a donor country, these projects are all the more meaningful. Now, Korea has been stepping up efforts to increase its ODA volume, but so have other countries like the US, China, and Japan. So it seems we're seeing a growing competition in diplomacy through ODA.
Right. Increasing the absolute amount of the ODA toward these developing countries has been the main homework for South Korea. Let me just give you some figures for the sake of comparison. The volume of ODA from China to Africa has been about $20 billion each year, and $9.1 billion has been provided by the United States each year. And the ODA from Japan to African continent was, in average, $1.75 billion. And Abe administration recently decided to increase for the next 5 years. In comparison, South Korea's ODA toward the African country remains at a very low level, around $120 million each year, which is less than 10% of the Japan's ODA. It is unlikely for South Korea would be able to generate much impact on African countries, at least in the short term. So the immediate task for South Korean government is to increase the sheer amount of ODA.
Well, ODA can come in many different forms, though, and Korea has 새마을 운동, or the New Village movement, that's considered to be a very unique ODA model. What do you think makes the 새마을 movement attractive to these developing countries?
Well, 새마을 운동 has been one of the very important factors realizing the economic miracle in Korea. So this movement, can be a kind of some signal to wake up their economy, which means that Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. And then it's not everything. 새마을 movement was not everything, but definitely it ignited the changes in Korea. So sharing our experiences with the African people, definitely they could get confidence. They can do what they want to do. So I think in this context, 새마을 movement is very welcomed by many African nations. And then on the top of this one, some of the African countries have already enjoyed the very fruitful outcomes created by 새마을 movement.
The spirit of the 새마을 movement, which put emphasis on the can-do spirit, as you emphasize, and taking ownership of your own problem rather than lamenting or blaming, will be a very good introduction to African countries about how to keep in good harmony between its own indigenous effort and initiative and the provision of ODA from outside world.
Well, on this particular trip, a new form of ODA is being introduced called Korea Aid, and that is set to reflect the changing times.
Right. The flip side of the unfortunate reality that the sheer size of the ODA from Korea is not as substantial as the ODA provided by the other major economies is that South Korea needs to come up with very creative way of doing ODA policy toward these recipient countries in Africa. Targeting and tailor-making are the key missions for Korea's ODA policy. Considering that Korea Aid program is very attractive and creative, that it's a synergy of the Korea's unique strength, that very strong mobile telecommunication technology and the transportation system. And unlike many of the major donor countries, South Korea has been very famous in terms of sending soldiers on the ground. So there's no long distance between Korean ODA officials on the ground and the local people receiving the benefits of the Korea's ODA. The only problem with this Korea Aid problem is its sustainability. Because of the overall quality of infrastructure in many of the African countries is still poor. So the mobility of the Korea Aid mission teams can be easily truncated. So it has to go along with the general improvement of the infrastructure conditions of these countries.
In the meantime, while the president's visiting these 3 African nations, Seoul's Ministry of Culture has planned various events to introduce Korean culture to the people of Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. As of yet, they don't know much about us. We don't know much about them.
No.
What can we do to enhance mutual cultural ties?
Well, of course, owing to the development of transportation and telecommunication, we can easily get access to the African culture. But how about the African countries? They do not have any, not yet enjoy the benefits of the telecommunications and transportation, development of these 2 things relatively. I have by myself and participate in the many ODA projects. Whenever we have a chance to visit several African countries, I brought some the pictures and then books about Korean culture. So the response was quite surprised because that I got so many emails, and when I donated some books to the school over there, the school principal sent me an email that could you send more or something like that. I think so at private level, individual level and national level, we have to send more materials and then books and then videos. These things could be the first step. And when I visit to Congo, I was very surprised. I could listen the one of the very famous song by the Korean singer. Then
Psy.
And when some kids are dancing, with the size song, I was very surprised. So I think for the time being, we have to use the ODA as a way to introduce our culture.
Well, there are some countries in Africa that have strong ties with North Korea. How about the 3 countries that President Park's visiting?
Well, actually, they used to have very strong ties with the North Korea, but very recently, we can see the changes in the stance of these African countries towards North Korea and towards us, because that the Africa is no longer. They want to stay in the third world countries. The ideological conflict has been eroded out. I think many nations are seeking for tangible benefits. They just try to put more priorities on the economic relations rather than political relations. In this context, definitely, the many African countries try to get closer to South Korean side rather than North Korean side. But still, they are playing the game. They want to hold the North Korean hands with one hand, and with the other hands, they want to hold the South Koreans' hands, and then maybe they will continue to judge which one could be more beneficial to them. So I think that they will getting closer to us as time goes on.
Well, African cooperation will be helpful in stepping up pressure on North Korea. Do you think this trip will bear any weight in that regard?
Frankly speaking, no. Not because there's something wrong with regard to the summit diplomacy waged by President Park Geun-hye, but because North Korea already hit the bottom. North Korea has been completely discredited by African countries. As Professor Shin explained that there's not much African countries wants from North Korea. There's a saying that it is not you, but it's your entourage. You are defined by people you are surrounded with. And not many African countries would want to be identified with North Korea. North Korea does not command the image of bright future or proud past anymore. And North Korea used to carry some strategic values for many African countries when 2 Koreas were not member states of the United Nations. So they were able to maximize their diplomatic gains by pitting one Korea against the other. But that strategic room to maneuver is no longer available. And North Korea, because of its nuclear weapons program, its status has been totally discredited, as well illustrated by the poor reception by the president of the Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who used to be regarded as a very good friend of the former leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, since he seized the power in 1987. But after he made a visit, three visits to North Korea, he did not show any continued enthusiasm in maintaining friendly relationship with North Korea after the death of Kim Il-sung. So, not because South Korea's approach to African countries in hope to gain their support for South Korea's claim for keeping Korean Peninsula free of nuclear weapons threat, but because North Korea is already discredited. So you cannot really get any more water by squeezing dry towel. Mm-hmm. So I think the focus of President Park Geun-hye's diplomatic discussion with the heads of states in these three African countries should be on sharing the common understanding about the threat of nuclear weapons to world peace and security.
Well, let's hope President Park's trip to Africa will produce more opportunities for cooperation and contribute to expanding Korea's diplomatic reach. Straight from Africa, the president will travel to France next week. Here's what we can expect from the final leg of her overseas tour. Well, this year marks the 130th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Korea and France. How did this trip to France come about?
Well, last November, President Hollande paid his official visit to Korea, and then he invited President Park Geun-hye to France. So she accepted the invitation, and that she is paying her state visit to France. And this year is quite significant, as you mentioned before. This year marks the 130th anniversary of diplomatic ties between two countries. And economically, I think these two countries, for France, Korea is very important. And for Korea, France is also important. But both countries are facing economic challenges. So as an economic partner is very important. So during her state visit, President Park Geun-hye will discuss about how to promote mutual investment and the mutual trade, and then how they build the R&D cooperation network, particularly in new industries. And they talk about how to cooperate in the creative economies. Well, in fact, the French has quite high technology in some the advanced industries, such as biotechnologies, which is key industry for the creative economies in Korea. So I think during this state visit, definitely the first priorities have been put on the economic issues rather than political issues. Of course, they will talk about how to cooperate about economic sanctions against North Korea, but I think, they put more priorities on economic issues rather than political issues during this visit.
Well, President Park's going to be able to take a small trip down memory lane. I understand she's set to visit the city of Grenoble, where she studied 42 years ago.
Yeah, taking the memory lane captures the entire spirit of her trip to France. I believe that she will have an opportunity to engage in deep thoughts about her personal journey. The fact on the ground is that she represents the only case in entire history of Korean politics that her family produced two presidents, not one. For the first time, we have two presidents coming from the same family. And who would have imagined? President Park Geun-hye herself had no idea what kind of future was lying ahead of her when she was just an innocent, diligent student in France. So I hope that she will have a refreshing and relaxing, but at the same time deep, time of self-introspection, and we'll be able to go back to the deep in her heart, the beginning of her determinations to engage in public service for the nation.
Now, President Park and her French counterpart, François Hollande, are scheduled for their fourth summit meeting. You mentioned President Hollande visited Korea last year. What do you think will be on their agenda this time? There's talk of a joint declaration that's going to be made.
I think they will accept the joint declaration on the occasion of the 130th anniversary of diplomatic relations between two countries. Actually, this communique, the declaration, is a kind of action plan of the comprehensive and strategic partnership, which was discussed and then adopted by the two leaders when the President Hollande paid his official visit last November. So I think this is a kind of some key part of this summit meeting. And on the top, within this framework, definitely, as I explained briefly already, the two leaders will discuss about how to strengthen economic ties between two countries. Very recently, if I give more detailed explanation, Korean economy has been slowed down, and we are afraid of maybe be trapped, so-called deflation trap. And then how about France? France is facing various serious situations in dealing with many economic issues such as labor relations. And then also French economy has been slowed down. Definitely both leaders try to find the way to promote the depressed economies of these two countries. Definitely there will be some area which both countries can contribute to each other. I think so during the summit meeting, definitely these two leaders just try to take the tangible actions to strengthen economic ties.
Anything you hope to see out of this French trip?
Two things can be also included in the joint declaration: how both nations will carry out the agreements made in the Paris Climate Change Conference, because France was the host country, and South Korea pledged a big commitment to participating the international effort to curb the problem. And the other one is to issue their joint commitment to defending and deterring the threat of international terrorism after the Paris terrorist attack.
Well, we have to wrap up our discussion here. Your final thoughts of the week.
Well, I want to step up the cooperation with the African countries. As we discussed many times, the Korean economy should be stepped up in every sense, and then one of the way for certainly it can be realized with the more active cooperation with the African nations. So we have to use this opportunity to strengthen the economic ties with the African nations.
Dr. Bong?
Park Geun-hye diplomacy has been focusing on making new friends in Iran and African countries. But I'm afraid that she will continue to be very busy in terms of, from this time on, keeping old friends close to South Korea. In the aftermath of US President Obama's historic visit to Vietnam and to Hiroshima in Japan, then South Korea will be inevitably compared to the upgraded security partnership between the United States and Vietnam and between United States and Japan. So President Park Geun-hye will need to engage in a diplomatic conversation with Washington about how to upgrade South Korea-US security alliance.
Well, thank you two very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. That is all for this edition of News Inside. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with more next week.